I just wanted to make sure he knew how to float. Anna, Brice's stepmother, told you yesterday about teaching Brice how to float. She wasn't trying to make Brice swim team captain. She was simply trying to make sure that he knew how to float. And we don't let the people that we love drown. I was swim team captain when I was in high school, and I was also a lifeguard for 6 years. And I agree with Anna that it is very important that we teach our children how to float. In the 6 years that I lifeguarded, I was very fortunate that I only had one jump-in rescue. And I remember it very vividly. The young man that I pulled out of the water that day, he didn't know how to swim. He had just drifted into the deep end. It was a YMCA. There was a line that cut up between the 5-6 feet to the 10 feet, and he went over the line and didn't know how to swim. He didn't know how to float. He was okay. I blew my whistle. I jumped in. I pulled him out, and we filled out an incident report. And while I was finishing the incident report, he went back to the pool deck. And before I had the chance to finish completing the incident report, I heard the whistle blow again. And when I came out back to the pool deck, I saw that my fellow lifeguard was in the water with this young man again, pulling him out of the water a second time. And before that young man left the pool that day, he tried to get in the water for a third time. To an outsider, to an onlooker who didn't know this man, it didn't make any sense. Why would this young man who did not know how to swim, did not know how to float, keep getting back in the water and trying to go to the deep end? What was wrong with him? Was he trying to play games with us? Did he want to drown? Why did he keep doing this? It doesn't make sense if you don't have context. I had the chance to speak with him while we filled out that incident report. And I came to learn that he didn't come to the pool on his own. He came to the pool with an assistant, with a caseworker, someone that helped him with his everyday living activities, helped him manage his money, helped him get on the bus, and helped him get his exercise. And they were working together on learning how to float, how to swim, and his goal was to one day, perhaps, learn to swim in the deep end. Now, I have no idea whether that was something that this young man was capable of, but he clearly wasn't capable of it at that time. At that time, he did not know how to float, but he didn't understand that. All he wanted was to keep on the progress that he'd been working with his caseworker. All he wanted was to show that he could do it. He couldn't understand that he couldn't magically decide to do something and then be capable of it. He didn't understand all those steps that he still had to take if he was indeed able to take those steps. Anna told us about Brice. She said, I just wanted to teach him how to float. And that's really just another way to say, I just wanted to teach him how not to drown. And that's what Anna told you that she was doing, making sure Brice stayed afloat, making sure that he didn't drown in the water. And unfortunately, I don't think that the water was the only place that Brice was drowning. I think from the evidence that you've heard over the last 2 days, yesterday and today, that from a very young age, Brice has been drowning. He's been trying to stay afloat. He's not been trying to swim. He's not been trying to reach the deep end. He's been just trying to stay afloat. And before I go any further in discussing Brice's life and the decision that you're ultimately going to make today in this case, I want to be very clear about what this part of trial is about and what it's not about, and what I'm here asking you to do. This phase of trial that we've been doing this week since Monday is not about accountability. You've already found Brice accountable. You listened to the evidence last week and on Monday, and you made your decision Monday night. The decision that you have today is punishment. And nothing that we've presented to you over the last 2 days, and nothing that I'm going to discuss with you now, is meant to take away from that accountability or that loss of life. Horrible things were done in May of 2016. An innocent man was gunned down in the street, and 2 teenagers were then brutally murdered. And you've held Brice accountable for his participation in these murders. The murders of Christopher Jones, of Maurice Gordon, and Larry Ordway. You've heard from their family members, those who have lost their loved ones. And I'm going to leave it to the state to discuss that loss, because that's their place. The state now wants you to lock Brice up. They want you to lock him up and throw away the key. And they want you to be angry. I want you to think about how many decisions you've made out of anger, and about how many of those decisions that you've later come to regret. Why? Why do we pause? Why do we stop? Why do we take a breath? Because when we act out of hate and anger, we lose empathy. We lose our heart. So when someone's life, Brice's life, his life and his freedom is at stake, I'm asking you to do something different, something difficult, something that may be uncomfortable. I'm asking you to hold on to your empathy and your heart, because no matter what Brice did on his worst days, Brice is still a human being. And so I'm asking you to make a rational decision. I'm not asking you to let him walk out of the courtroom today. I couldn't, even if I wanted to. That's not an option available to you. I'm not asking you to give him a total sentence of any specific term of years. Let's not forget that there is now no small sentence available to Brice now. The minimum available to you to punish Brice is 20 years on each count. And 20 years is a long time. But I'm not asking you for 20 years. I'm asking you to give Brice a chance at parole. I'm asking you not to give him life without the possibility of parole. I'm asking you to keep empathy and your heart close at hand when you decide what punishment to give him. And I'm asking you to have just a little bit of hope for Brice. Hope that with medication, he can overcome the symptoms of his mental illness, his bipolar disorder. Hope that with therapy and the help and support of his loved ones, like Anna, that he can learn how to manage his emotions, to regulate himself in times of stress, and manage to live in this world with his mental illness and his intellectual disability. Hope that with the passage of time, the passage of at least 20 years, that he will change. And that he will change because he will have something to work towards. Something to make him work and work hard on his own rehabilitation. A chance, just a spark of hope, a parole one day. Never a guarantee. Just a simple spark of hope, a reason to think, to reflect, and to work hard on who he wants to be. Punishment without understanding is not justice. It is vengeance. And all I'm asking you to do today is to give Brice consideration. I'm asking you to grant him mercy. I'm asking you to give him hope. Until today, since 2016, the weight of his life and what happens to him has been in the hands of legal teams of the state and the defense. But at the end of these closing arguments, that weight will be passed to you. And it is a heavy weight, I know. We've carried it for a long time now. And so while I won't talk for too long today, I do need to make sure that I passed along what we would like you to know about Brice, and make sure that you know what you can take into consideration when you make your individual decisions. I want you to take your time with that decision and not to feel pressured to reach a verdict, to take your time, to carefully weigh the evidence that's been presented to you. Brice's future, his life is at stake, and I want you to carefully weigh all of the evidence that's been presented to you last week and this week. I understand that the state wants to punish Brice, but I want to make sure that that punishment is one of justice, not one of vengeance. And it isn't an easy task, and the law does require you to make a few more considerations before you return a verdict as to his punishment. And you've sworn an oath to follow that law, to consider all of the evidence that's been presented to you, to consider the full range of penalty. You're required to consider the minimum just as much as you're required to consider the maximum. The law tells you in your jury instructions on page 4, instruction number 4, that your vote as to penalty, as to punishment, cannot be out of prejudice or fear of later prejudice or later criticism. Your vote cannot be based on what everyone out there thinks. It is your individual moral decision, not anyone else's. And I'm asking you to vote for a chance, for hope, and for an ounce of mercy. I'm asking you to vote from your heart, from your own moral compass. And I'm asking you to be willing to do what is uncomfortable. And the law may require you to not fear criticism and what everyone else out there thinks, and that's not easy, to set that aside. But it is what is required of you today. Giving Brice a chance at parole is the right choice in this case. It might be an uncomfortable choice, but it is the right choice. And it is the right choice based on Brice's intellectual disability, on his bipolar disorder, and the overwhelming amount of trauma and abuse that flooded his upbringing. In your jury instructions, you'll read on page 4, instruction number 3, that you have to make a determination as to an aggravating circumstance. Even if you make this finding, even if you find this aggravating circumstance, there is no automatic penalty. You may still fix his punishment at a sentence of 20 to 50 years at life without the possibility of parole for 25 years, or life without the possibility of parole at all. You are also required to consider any mitigating or extenuating facts and circumstances that have been presented to you in evidence and that you believe to be true. And a mitigating circumstance, and I'm going to read on page 1. A mitigating circumstance is any fact or factors about Brice Rhodes, about the crime or the case, which do not justify or excuse the offense, but in fairness and mercy lessen or reduce his responsibility or moral culpability for the crime, or which demonstrate that he is someone whose past or present circumstances indicate that he should receive a penalty other than life without the possibility of parole, or life without the possibility of parole for 25 years. Anything that you've heard, you could decide, you could find, is a mitigating fact or circumstance. And you don't all have to agree as to those mitigating circumstances or facts. 6 of you could find that his mental illness is a mitigating circumstance, and 6 of you could find that his intellectual disability is a mitigating circumstance. You don't have to agree as to the mitigation as to the mitigating circumstances. You do have to agree ultimately to a penalty. There are certain mitigating circumstances that you are specifically required to consider. And those are on page 3 of your jury instructions. You are required to give consideration to Brice's bipolar disorder, his relative culpability, and his intellectual disability. This week, you've heard additional evidence. Evidence about Brice, about his intellectual disability, and his bipolar diagnosis. And I know that it's hard to go back to last week and to think about the evidence presented to you then. But in order to consider, as the law requires you to do so, these 3 mitigating circumstances in particular, I'm asking you to think again about what you heard last week in light of what you've heard this week. Last week, the state would have you believe that Brice was the mastermind, the adult, the one in charge, telling everyone what to do, the leader. And they told you this was because he was the adult, that it was strange for this adult to be hanging out with teenagers. We already know from last week that Brice wasn't the only adult present. There are at least 2 other adults who were present the night Larry and Maurice were murdered. At least 2 other adults about which we know very little. And now you know more about Brice, and you know about his capacity, his reduced capacity due to his mental illness and intellectual disability. I'm asking you to reflect on what you heard from Dr. James about Brice's intellectual disability this morning. She told you that Brice struggles intellectually and that he has a low IQ. And the state wants you to believe that his IQ is maybe a little higher, and maybe it is, but not much higher. It's still a low IQ score. Dr. James told you that it is not uncommon for someone with an intellectual disability, like Brice, to spend time with people who are younger. It makes sense. We like to surround ourselves with people that are perhaps of similar functioning. We know that Brice doesn't like to be embarrassed or do things that he isn't good at or that he's afraid of. It makes sense that he would want to surround himself with people that he could perhaps keep up with teenagers, people he could maybe feel equal to, not behind. Brice struggles with thinking. We know he struggled with school, with his homework, and with basic tasks. Anna told you yesterday about her experience struggling with Brice, or with Brice struggling from a parent's perspective. And Dr. James today told you that not only does Brice struggle intellectually, but he struggles with what she calls adaptive functioning, his ability to function and do day-to-day, everyday tasks. And Dr. James conducted an in-person assessment with Brice's biological mother, LaShawna, who was with Brice throughout most of his childhood. Dr. James reviewed documents from Brice's childhood and memorandums from his family members, and she found that he had severe deficits in the areas of communication, functional academics, the social arena, and self-direction. Brice struggles in just about every area of life. Brice is continually trying to stay above water, to not drown, to simply function in everyday life. It's harder for Brice than it is for most of us. And on top of that, he has a mood disorder, a bipolar disorder. And you heard that from Dr. James as well. And Dr. James told you how that mood disorder interacts with his intellectual disability, compounding the challenges and difficulties that he has navigating everyday life and managing emotion and his reactions. You've held Brice accountable for his actions in May of 2016, and I'm not asking you to rethink that decision. I am asking you to take all of this that you've heard this week into consideration when you make your decision. You can take into consideration in your decision the plea deals that are in evidence, and you can still review those if you'd like to, and I encourage you to do so if you want to see them again. Anwan Carter and Jacory Taylor each received 10-year sentences. I believe one served 3 years and one served about 6.5. Now, those sentences are not available to Brice, but you can consider how they were punished when you decide how to punish Brice. Even if you find the aggravating circumstance, you are still required to consider Brice's intellectual disability and his bipolar diagnosis. We talked a lot about credibility of witnesses last week and on Monday. And when you want a diagnosis, when you want help and the right treatment, who do you go to? Maybe for a cold or the flu, you go to a generalist. Something quick, something cheap, something easy. But if you think there's something more serious wrong with you, if you suspect cancer or something really serious wrong with you, who do you go to? Do you go to a generalist? A jack of all trades? Or do you go to a specialist? Someone whose career and study and expertise is in your treatment, your diagnosis, and your condition. The state brought in the state's witness, Dr. Allen, from the state hospital. And he told you what he thought about Brice and his intellectual disability and his bipolar disorder. But Dr. Allen is not an expert in intellectual disability. You heard from Dr. James this morning, a neuropsychologist whose specialty is in intellectual disability and neurodevelopmental disorders. And she told you how she reached her finding and the basis for that finding of intellectual disability. And she also told you about a prior diagnosis that Brice has of bipolar disorder. Brice has an intellectual disability and bipolar disorder. And Dr. James told you how these impact him. Each of these, either of these on their own, could be a mitigating circumstance. A reason you could decide to give Brice less than a sentence of life without the possibility of parole. And Brice has not only one of these two, he has both. The law also requires that you consider any other circumstance from the evidence which you, as an individual or as a jury, find to be a mitigating factor or a factor in support of leniency. Brice has always been struggling to keep his head above water. We are most vulnerable when we are children. When we are children, we rely upon our parents, on the adults in our lives to keep us safe, to love us, to nurture us, and to help us build resiliency. I don't know what word or words the state will use to describe Brice now. The government tends to like labels: defendant, accused, convicted, broken, mentally ill. It is easier to lock someone up and throw away the key when they are reduced to a label. I do not describe Brice as intellectually disabled, as mentally ill, or any worse label. I will not reduce him to his worst moments or his weaknesses or his diagnoses. And I ask that you do the same, that you recognize him as he is, a human being who as a child suffered great trauma and who has a mental illness and who has an intellectual disability. When you make your decision today, you will not have to explain it or justify it. It is your choice. People with mental illness and intellectual disability and extreme trauma are not going anywhere. They're not. I think maybe we all wish that no one had to go through those adversities, that no one had to have such disadvantages or hardships or burdens or experience so much trauma. I think we all can agree on that, but they do. And these people will always exist. And so we have to remove the stigma around these disorders and treat them with empathy and from our hearts. People like Brice need help. More assistance than most of us. More help simply to not drown in the hardships any of us may face on a day-to-day basis. Through no fault of Brice's own, He started this life behind. He never had a chance, drowning before he could ever learn to float, let alone swim. And just because he has a mental illness, an intellectual disability, and because he experiences the effects of trauma, does not mean that he doesn't deserve to be punished. Just because he never had a chance doesn't mean he didn't have a choice. The law does demand, however, that you take it into consideration. Brice does not need to be locked away forever. What did Brice not have control over as a child? Abuse, trauma, the lack of effective and consistent intervention at a young age, lack of the right diagnosis and medication at a young age, lack of consistent love and nurture, and the chaotic environment that he lived in. Dr. Garbarino, an expert in trauma, spoke to you this morning as well, and he told you about Brice's trauma. He told you about adverse childhood experiences. We call them ACEs. These are experiences that many of us may have one or two of, and he told you that. But he also told you that 1 in 100 people have a score of 7 or more, and that only 1 in 1,000 has a score of 8, 9, or 10. And he told you Brice's score. Brice has a score of 8 adverse childhood experiences. So when I say that Brice never had a chance, when I say Brice started from behind, and when I say that Brice has been just barely managing to not drown, or perhaps has been drowning, that is why. I don't want to go through each individual adverse childhood experience because you've just heard that testimony. But what you heard from Dr. Garbarino as he talked about each factor was a glimpse into the chaos and abuse of Brice's life, of his childhood. We heard from Anna yesterday that she knew that there was abuse going on in his mother's household. And Dr. Garbarino told you today that Brice's stepfather would emotionally abuse Brice, alienating him from his own family. Brice was made to feel that he wasn't loved. He was alienated by those who were supposed to protect and love him. Anna told you about the time that his mother came to take Brice home, how Brice cried, and how he didn't want to go, and about that custody battle that should never have happened in front of a child that way. He was afraid to go home. That was the type of environment that he grew up in, one he was afraid to return to. He was punished with physical violence. And his stepfather physically abused his mother. And because Brice's mother was in an abusive relationship, dealing with her own very violent trauma and survival, Brice was left unprotected to observe the brutal violence committed by his stepfather against her. He saw him cut his mother's hair off, you heard that today, drag her and smash her face. That's something none of us want any child to ever have to witness. Brice witnessed this experience and much more. And so his development was stunted, it was changed. He was developmentally crushed by the adversity and trauma that he experienced in his childhood on top of his mental health and intellectual disability. I've asked you to have hope for Brice. And Dr. Garbarino and Dr. James have told you that there is hope. Brice is not a lost cause. He has overwhelming challenges that he's going to have to overcome and decide for himself to overcome. And he cannot do it alone. Dr. Garbarino and Dr. James told you that he does have the capacity for change, the capacity for hope. He needs to be medicated, and he needs therapy, and he needs time. And no matter your decision today, he's going to have access to those 3 things. He can receive medication and therapy in prison, and he's likely going to serve at least 20 years, so he's going to have plenty of time in prison. The time that he needs to work on himself. And he can also receive and be ordered to maintain his medication and his mental health treatment if he's ever granted parole. His stepmother, Anna, will also be there if he's paroled. She told you that. She's been in the mental health profession in this area in Indiana and Louisville for 28 years, and she can help, and she wants to help Brice connect with mental health professions in the area. With the resources available to him. And if he fails to do what he is told, his parole can be revoked and he can be sent back. And if he doesn't try in the first place, if he doesn't try medication, if he doesn't try therapy, if he doesn't try the programming that's available to him in the Department of Corrections, if he doesn't apply himself, he may never be paroled. Which is why I'm asking you to give him that chance, that hope to work towards. Give him a purpose to work towards, to keep him on track. He has a lot to overcome, and it may seem insurmountable to you. It may feel easy to give up on Brice and to do as the state asks you, to throw away the key. But I'm asking you not to. And the law does require you to consider all of the evidence from all of the witnesses and to take into consideration Brice's mental illness, his intellectual disability, his relative culpability, his trauma, and anything else from the evidence presented to you that in your empathy and your whole heart you find cause for leniency. I want to end by taking us back to what Anna told us about Brice's brother. Brice's brother came to their family at about the same time that Brice himself did. And his brother also struggled with school. She told us that he had behavioral outbursts as well. Anna wanted both Brice and his brother to stay with them, to attend a good school with good resources, to be assessed and to receive help at school, to be loved and nurtured, and above all else, safe. We know that when Brice was with Anna, he came out of his shell. He let down his guard. He got just a taste of what it was like to be loved, to be safe and protected. But Brice did not get to be with Anna for very long. His brother did. His brother stayed. And his brother went on to excel at sports and at school and is now a professor. And you know where Brice is. Brice is right here, sitting here today, his fate in your hands. With love, with intervention, with treatment and consistency, Brice's brother was able to find resiliency and eventually stability that led to his success. And I think the evidence presented to you over the last 2 days shows that while Brice did not have the love, intervention, treatment, or consistency in his childhood, that he can find those things in his future, behind bars, in a correctional setting, and that he will have the best motivation if you grant him the mercy of a chance at parole to work towards. On Monday, you didn't have the opportunity to know Brice, to take into consideration his life and his mental health. Just as any onlooker at the pool that day at the YMCA when I had my first rescue, just as any onlooker did not have the opportunity to understand the young man that I pulled out of the pool and then got back in the water 2 more times. You did not on Monday have the opportunity to understand Brice. I mean, you now had an opportunity. You know more about who Brice is. I wish that 9-year-old Brice was here and that he could tell you from his heart what his life was like and what he was going through at that time, but 9-year-old Brice isn't here. And we can't save 9-year-old Brice. But there is something that we can do, because I think Brice is still drowning. And it may take some time for him to learn to float again. But I ask you to give him that chance to show that he can change. I'm asking you to give him a chance at parole, a chance at life, a chance at hope.
I'm not asking you to lock him up and throw away the key. What I'm asking is that you impose a legally allowable sentence at the conclusion of this proceeding where he has been given the due process that we all enjoy in this country.